Their first assignment, first commandment, you might say, was to name all things. That's a task we're still engaged in. We give names to fish newly discovered at the bottom of the ocean. We name the features on the planets and other bodies in our solar system, the furthest reaches of the cosmos, seeing and naming the structures in that most complex thing that we know of, the human brain. And of course, we have given names to the divine. Indeed. In part, this talk was inspired by a short story from Arthur C. Clarke, published back in 1953, called The 9 Billion Names of God. You can find a copy of it. It's worth the reading. While I was preparing this talk, I found it done as a short film on YouTube. Really well done. I want to check that out. Since nowadays we're more used to big numbers than they were back in mid-century. If it were written today, it might be the 9 trillion names of God. And what comes into your mind when you think of God? I mean, we realize, of course, that whatever we imagine, whatever we envision, it is not God. Generations of theologians have concluded that speaking of God as a thing is meaningless. Although if there is one thing to be said for certain about God, it is that if you listen to 1,000 theologians discourse on God for 1,000 hours apiece, you would know no more about the subject coming out than you did going in. In fact, there have been schools of study given to describing what God is not. Saying that, we still like to make pronouncements, don't we? Athletes claim divine intervention in their triumphs. We hear politicians cite divinity to rationalize their behaviors and doctrines. Swami Vivekananda says, God is laughing with us, not at us. I like to say that God created time to keep everything from happening at once. Albert Einstein famously declared that God does not play dice with the universe. I mentioned describing what God is not. Artists learn the technique of drawing negative space, of drawing what surrounds the subject. I'm using the names of God in a similar manner, hoping that by hearing what names other people have given to the faces of divinity, that what they have seen will help us see what is outside God, and so perhaps discern a little bit better what the nature of God is. And to some people, it matters exactly how people do speak of God. You can tell this joke is old because it involves a beatnik. A parish priest watches this little old beatnik come into his chapel every day and spend 30 minutes or more in devout prayer, eventually becoming curious as to what these prayers were about. His pastor slips up behind him one day to listen in, and as the little fellow's on his way out, the priest stops. My son, I really do appreciate your piety and your devotion to the faith. Pauses, continues. However, I just have to say that we address the Trinity as Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, not Daddy-O Jr. and Spook. So what's in a name? What do we call our perception of the divine? According to Phil Cousineau in his book, Word Catcher, the word itself, God, derives from a Sanskrit word, uk. That which is invoked is how it would be translated into English. That which is called to, which is beyond us and yet aware of us, with which we are connected somehow. An awareness of this great mysterium tremendum runs deep in the human psyche. We look at the most ancient evidence of human culture, we see this has been true for the greater part of our human experiences. As a matter of illustration, imagine one of those hanging crystal spheres that put spectrums all over their space. From that crystal's point of view, all of those little spectrums happen at the same time, simultaneously. It's a handy metaphor for that which lies beyond our ken, outside of our ability to know, just as each facet of that crystal is responsible for diffracting one of those dancing spectra. Each and every name we give to this divine principle that we invoke can be seen as eliminated by yet another facet of the divine. The earliest human societies seem to have viewed themselves as participants in a world in which all that was existed as a representation of a greater, overarching reality. The plants, the springs and streams, the forces of nature were all directly connected with this more exalted, more perfect realm. Over the eons, we find that this vision of this higher realm, from which ours is diffracted into reality, transformed from a psychological model serving the psyches of those earliest troops of hominids foraging across the landscape, into one that spoke to the earliest urban cultures, one better suited to the needs and circumstances of those living in these young cities. And this was a time when all cities were holy cities, founded and erected by the gods. Human built, they were still viewed as modeling the dwellings of the divine pantheon. That divine pantheon, of course, tended to be messy, fractious, vindictive forces of nature, not to be trifled with. Each member of these divine assemblages had a name. They were all derived from aspects of the world around them. In early Mesopotamian myth, for example, we find deities identified with water. Apsu with the clear, sweet river water, and Tiamat with the salty waters of the sea. These terms also translate into meaning abyss or void. As the human psyche grew into the capacities of its new brain, people became able to discern with greater clarity. These earlier concepts gave way to increasingly well-defined ideas of the divine. These new cosmogonies came into themselves in pairs in a process scholars refer to as emanation. Emanation serves as a sort of cosmic evolution by which the various elements of divinity became embedded in the psychology of the new forming religious expression. Starting from the watery unity of an abyss emanates a pair whose name indicates an earth and water mixture, a silt. Find pairs named for sea and sky, meeting at the horizon until we arrive at the earth and the heavens. More names, more facets of the divine. The process continues as the earliest gods gave way or were taken down, the younger gods tending to be more active, more vigorous than their predecessors. The overall thrust of these titanic struggles was an increase of order over chaos, and order overseen by a panoply of divine beings. Once, humankind had walked among the gods just as much as they did among the animals they fetishized, walked with their gods, spoke with the divine, ate with, and even grappled with them in the flesh. Then, in the eyes of humanity, we became separated spiritually from the beasts and the gods. These more distant new gods still struggled mightily to preserve the hard-won order they had achieved. In part, this involved an annual conclave of the gods, and central to this event was the reading of a sacred liturgy. By this time, Babylon was the established center of the Mesopotamian world, and therefore the great assembly took place at the center in Babylon. Babylon being, of course, the earthly representation of the sacred realm for the festival celebrating the sun god Marduk. Babylon's great ziggurat was built for this annual celebration as a symbolic representation of the sacred realm. I'm sticking with Mesopotamian cosmology for this, largely for simplicity. If I were going to go off into the writings from India, go into the Vedas or the Mahabharata, none of us have the stamina at this point, even if I were foolish enough to try. Now, I will say this about the Fertile Crescent. I also want to stay in the Fertile Crescent because it is out of these earliest beliefs that our modern monotheistic religions, the religions of the book, grew. I will say this about the religious offerings of the Indian subcontinent. We get still more names for God, and so are able to see more facets, more dancing spectra of the ineffable, from the all-encompassing Atman to the more particularized, such as Shiva, Krishna, or Vishnu, to name just some of the more familiar ones. Meanwhile, back in the Fertile Crescent, We find the Mesopotamian myths beginning to influence those of the people to the east, surfacing for our opinions, or for our purposes, in the land of Canaan. The earliest known Canaanite tales invite Baal-Habad, Yam-Nahar, Asherah, and El. This last, El, being the Canaanite high god, and under him the first two had respectively lordship over storm and fertility by Baal, while Yam-Nahar had held sway over rivers and seas. Asherah was the wife of El and the mother of gods. Each of these names was given to those powers that the people wished to invoke, to the various aspects of that divinity discernible by them. The theme that occurs repeatedly in myth is of a high god gradually becoming unapproachably distant and then being supplanted by more vigorous offspring. Variations found from Babylon and Canaan to the Greeks, where earlier titans were dispatched by the Olympian pantheon. Again, more names. More names are given to more facets of divinity. Another recurring mythic theme is the searching goddess. Isis, Anat, Ishtar, and Nana are some of the names given to the great goddess. It is her task to search for and find the dead god or goddess so they can be resurrected and thus return life to the earth. Can it be any wonder that in those earlier times the great mother might be invoked, or that the tale of her sorrowful search resonated then as it resonates in here in our time? Throughout the Bible, the common reference is Lord, and many of the other references are titles such as Lord of Hosts, the God of your fathers is another frequently found. Sorts of titles show some of the various aspects the devotees of the days perceive. In our time, informed by the findings in the fields of quantum physics or astronomy, we might speak of a fountain of creation or a patterner of chaos as terms by which we might invoke the divine. Terms that we might use as part of that negative space by which we seek to ascertain some concept or comprehension of the vastness of that mind which holds all creation within its own deep thoughts. In Exodus, when Moses asks what name he should tell when his followers ask how to call their new God, the answer he received was, well, actually, of course, it depends on the translation. In the Lammas Bible, Exodus 3:14 says, and God said to Moses, I am Ahia, Ashar I, which means the living God. Moses was told to tell them Ahia has sent me to you. In a 2021 edition of the King James Version, we find this verse as the more familiar I am that I am. And Moses was told to speak of I am. A verse is like the combination of the living I am as a statement of self-consciousness, awareness. A sense of that this loving God is too distant was, to my mind, a motivation for the seeking after messiahs, which occurred throughout the Middle East, predating the birth of Jesus, continuing afterwards for that matter. Then Mary's son, the living I am, came bodily into the flesh of the earth to feel the fates of these beings which that one had created. In Buddhist teachings, we find the statement, all things that live are the divided, and that which is apart is the undivided, the one. These certainly find resonance in our unity thought. Where we differ from that idea is that all lives is divided, is that unity's belief that which lives is all connected through the Creator, through the brilliance which shines within us. I've been speaking through the lens of history, a tale of how Homo sapiens, aged sap to their friends, has seen that living I am, and how these views changed over time. Changed because the evolving conditions of the people of those times demanded fresh insight. Conditions which continue to evolve, requiring changing visions of God. It is no longer possible to view the Sistine Chapel, for instance, as anything other than art. Heaven is no longer found in the sky, which we now know to be far vaster and weirder than could have been imagined a century ago. The Fillmores saw God within us all, in unity. All of us, everyone, is a bearer of the infinite flame of creation. Our consciousness may be viewed perhaps as a sort of divine spectrum diffracted on the reality of our physical brain. So now, revere them though we do, we have come to look beyond ancient texts. We have come to a time of changes as we find ourselves grappling, like Jacob and the angel, with the facts of an infinite cosmos. Less than a century ago, our minds dwelt in relatively speaking, a compact universe. Finding only cold beauty in the heavens, we come back to earth. Find God's name on the leaves of the trees. Find it on the scales of the fishes, the live snakes and lizards, on the feathers of birds. We hear it if we stop to listen. The name on the wind, in the sounds of water, or of wee froggies all of a chorus. We find it within ourselves, a portion of each person. We may speak of our spirit or of our souls, speak of a part of ourselves which exists beyond our physical presence and capacities. These too are among God's names. So too we might say that justice is among those names. If God is within us, then God is in all of us. Tough though it may be to admit sometimes, we all have things in common. We speak of consciousness as one of those myriad names. We speak of a supreme consciousness. I use the analogy of consciousness being the divine spectrum cast onto our brain. Can we speak of truth as one of these names? Search for truths of the natural world is the underlying goal of all scientific research, besides carrying on with that most ancient of holy undertaking, the naming of all that is, or at least all that we are aware of, able to conceive of. Is one of God's names beauty. In the more abstract realms of mathematics, the beauty of an equation can have sway in it being accepted. Beyond this, there is the visceral sense of awe great beauty can evoke. This is the feeling the builders of the great cathedrals all go for. Is it a feeling that you get viewing a magnificent vista or a redwood grove, our inner self speaking the name of God? Is it coming out of our divine aspect, saying more of God's names? Is love one of God's names? What about compassion? Isn't that an aspect of ourselves we invoke? What are the aspects of ourselves we seek to invoke? What portions of our personalities do we want to develop, bring out in order to be more fully in the eye of the mind that guides our steps through our darkness, through our travails, whether we see the path or not? Before I really get the bit in my teeth and take off in earnest, let me offer one final name before I go, and that name is Thou. Thou truly art God. Blessed be. Thank you very much, everybody.
Charlie, that was really good. Great. Okay, now if I could have a couple of ushers. One for our offering, so if you'd like to take your offering and together to say our affirmation. Together, divine love, through me, does multiply all that I have, all that I give, and all that I receive. Thank you. I'll remember that. All right. We know they go out and they bless our community, our church, and our world.